Highlights from NASA's reveal of the Artemis moon astronauts. The crew of 3 Americans and 1 Canadian will be the first humans to fly toward the moon in more than 50 years. Houston, for the first time in more than half a century, NASA has named a crew of astronauts headed to the moon. Humans have not ventured more than a few hundred miles off the planet since the return of Apollo 17, NASA's last moon mission, in 1972. After Artemis's experience on the moon, NASA hopes to chart a path to putting humans on Mars, while scientists expect to use what is found there to answer questions about how the solar system formed. Astronauts in 2023 are much different from those when the United States was in a race to beat the Soviet Union to the moon. During the Apollo program, 24 astronauts flew to the moon, and 12 of them stepped on the surface. All of them were Americans. All of them were white men, many of whom were test pilots. The astronauts Reed Wiseman, Christina Koch, Victor Glover and Jeremy Hansen were selected to embark on a future 10-day mission orbiting the moon. Credit NASA Johnson Space Center. They are Reed Wiseman, the mission's commander; Victor Glover, the pilot; Christina Koch, mission specialist; and Jeremy Hansen, also a mission specialist. The first 3 are NASA astronauts, while Mr. Hansen is a member of the Canadian Space Agency. When we were selecting astronauts back then, Mr. Glover said in an interview, we intended to select the same person, just multiple copies. Ms. Koch will be the first woman to venture beyond low Earth orbit, and Mr. Hansen, as a Canadian, the first non-American to travel that far. So am I excited, Ms. Koch said during an event unveiling the crew at Ellington Field, a small airport used by NASA for the training of astronauts. Absolutely. But my real question is, are you excited? The assembled crowd cheered in response. The mission is a major step in NASA's Artemis program to send astronauts back to the surface of the moon to explore the cold regions near the moon's south pole. Water ice found in deep dark craters there could supply water and oxygen for future astronauts as well as fuel for missions deeper into space. Together, we are going to the moon, to Mars and beyond, said Bill Nelson, the NASA administrator. But the 4 astronauts aboard this next mission, Artemis E, will not land on the moon. Instead, the travelers will take a 10-day journey that will swing around the moon and come back to Earth. It is currently scheduled for late next year. It's an exciting time for the Artemis people, no question about it, Harrison Schmitt, the last surviving astronaut from Apollo 17, said in an interview. He added that many people did not fully realize that we are about 3 generations away from any experience with human beings being in deep space, and that's probably the most important part of the mission. A person in a helmet and coverall stands beneath a large metal fuel tank hanging from a crane in a vast industrial facility. Production of a liquid oxygen tank for the Artemis E mission's rocket at the MICHT assembly facility in New Orleans. Credit NASA. Dr. Schmitt, who is also a former United States Senator from New Mexico, said he was not necessarily surprised that it had taken so long. I would say I'm disappointed, he said. A lot of things conspired to stop the Apollo program and to keep us from going back for quite a while. Mr. Hansen noted that the United States could have undertaken the Artemis missions by itself but instead chose to pull together an international collaboration with Canada and the European Space Agency. That agreement reserved a seat for a Canadian astronaut on Artemis E. All of Canada is grateful for that global mindset and that leadership, Mr. Hansen said. Mr. Glover, who was the first black man to serve as a crew member on the International Space Station, said that diversity was an important aim of the agency and our partners, but it was also going to happen organically because of the core that we have that represents America so well, he said. As the name of the mission indicates, Artemis E will be the second in NASA's Artemis program. Artemis I launched last November as an uncrewed test of the Space Launch System, NASA's giant new rocket, and the Orion astronaut capsule. The Orion spacecraft spent 2 weeks in orbit around the Moon before returning to Earth, splashing down in the Pacific. After years of delay, development of the rocket took longer than originally promised. The Artemis I mission progressed smoothly for the most part, although some problems occurred. The heat shield of Orion protected the spacecraft during re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere, but more of it came off than had been expected. Artemis I, with 4 astronauts aboard, will allow a full check of the Orion's life support systems. Then NASA officials will feel more confident in undertaking the longer, more complex Artemis I mission, which will include 2 astronauts landing near the South Pole. Mr. Wiseman, Mr. Glover and Ms. Koch all said they were not disappointed that being part of the Artemis I crew rules out the possibility of walking on the Moon during Artemis I. This is going to probably sound click, Mr. Wiseman said, but just flying on any of these missions is an enormous thing. It's fantastic. I love the idea of going out past the Moon. He added, watching our astronaut colleagues walk on the Moon will be a success for us. After a long afternoon of interviews with reporters, the 4 astronauts left the Johnson Space Center, accompanied by a police escort, to an RG Stadium in downtown Houston to watch the NCAA Men's Basketball Championship game between the University of Connecticut and San Diego State University. NASA is currently aiming for that first moon landing to occur in late 2025, but the NASA Inspector General has predicted the mission would slip to 2026 or later. The Artemis I mission requires the use of Starship, the giant spacecraft being developed by SpaceX, Elon Musk's rocket company, to take the 2 astronauts from a distant lunar orbit to the surface. The first test launch of Starship to space might take off in the coming weeks. In the 1960s, the space race reflected the geopolitical jousting between the United States and the Soviet Union. Once the race was won, interest in the Moon by the public, politicians and even NASA waned. There are some geopolitical echoes this time too. China is also aiming to send astronauts to the Moon in the coming years. But it is not just governments aiming for the Moon now. Image. The Starship prototype, a black rocket stacked on top of a silver rocket at the test stand with the Texas coast extending on in the background. The Starship prototype at a SpaceX facility near Boca Chica, Texas. Credit SpaceX. Yusaku Maezawa, a Japanese billionaire, has bought a trip on Starship that would loop around the Moon similar to the trajectory that Artemis I will take. Dennis Tito, an entrepreneur who was the first space tourist to visit the International Space Station in 2001, and his wife, Akiko, have booked seats on a separate Starship trip around the Moon. 5 decades ago, that would have been like a billionaire buying a Saturn V, the rocket that propelled the Apollo astronauts to the Moon. Today, it seems almost inevitable that the footprints of tourists will crisscross the lunar surface in the years to come. In an interview, Chris Hadfield, a Canadian astronaut who retired in 2013 after 3 trips to space, compared space travel to the early days of aviation. The wobbly craft that the Wright brothers built in 1903 flew, but barely. But progress was fast. The first flight for KLM, the Dutch airline, was in 1920. 17 years from the Wright brothers to a profitable airline that's still around, Mr. Hadfield said. He added that innovation had greatly reduced the cost of leaving Earth. You can see that the cost is going to keep coming down as the vehicles get better proven, and that's going to increase the access and opportunity, Mr. Hadfield said. For the Artemis I astronauts, Dr. Schmidt offered some simple advice. Just enjoy it, he said. Vyosa Isai and Jesus Jimenez contributed reporting. A busy year ahead on the Moon. You'll have to wait until at least the end of 2024 for the astronauts of Artemis I to launch toward the Moon. But our lunar neighbor could get several new robotic visitors in 2023. The first moon landing attempt of the year is expected to occur at the end of April. iSpace, a private Japanese company, launched its M1 robotic lander in December, carrying cargo built by the space agencies of Japan and the United Arab Emirates. The spacecraft reached lunar orbit on March 21 and the company has yet to announce the date of its landing attempt. It's been more than 50 years since astronauts visited the moon. On deck 14, 1972, two men woke up on humanity's last day on the moon. Nobody would be back to the moon anytime soon. Plans for additional Apollo missions had been scrapped 2 years earlier. A few minutes ahead of their scheduled wake-up time, two NASA astronauts, Eugene A. Cernan and Harrison Schmitt, called home from Apollo 17's smelly, dust-strewn lunar module to croon "Good morning to you down to Earth." Mission Control responded with a blast of "Also Sprach Zarathustra." There's only 24 people in the history of the world who have seen the full circle of the Earth, and they're all Americans, said Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in a call with Mr. Hansen, shared on YouTube. "Well, you will be the first Canadian, the first non-American. This is a big deal. Artemis IE and beyond. If Artemis IE is successful, it will set up the biggest event in human spaceflight since the 1970s. Artemis IE, a mission that will send astronauts to the lunar surface, that is currently scheduled for no earlier than December 2025, and NASA has not